Well, welcome everyone to the second colloquium of the Institute for Ethics in AI here in Oxford. Again, we've got a hybrid event with a hand-picked audience actually physically present and also a virtual audience watching from YouTube. And this time I will not forget to say that we're very happy to receive also questions from people watching on YouTube. Please put your questions in the chat box. Our topic today is the EU proposal for an AI regulation, a step towards a responsible global framework. So those of you paying attention will know our last speaker was from Facebook. So we asked ourselves the question, which entity in this world is more powerful than Facebook? Obvious answer is the European Union. So now we're going to address the European Union's proposals for AI regulation. In April of this year, the European Commission published its draft proposal for an AI regulation. This is a near-comprehensive code for the regulation of AI, near-comprehensive because it excludes some important matters like military applications. It adopts a risk-based approach that attempts to calibrate the level of regulation to the degree of risk posed by various AI systems. And thereby it seeks to navigate the twin dangers of, on the one hand, over-regulating, on the other hand, under-regulating. So in this risk-based framework, some AI systems are just prohibited, for example, those used for subliminal manipulation. Some AI systems are designated as high risk, and they attract the most exacting forms of regulation, including obligations regarding having high-quality data, documentation and traceability, transparency, human oversight, accuracy, and robustness. And then there are non-high-risk systems, which are subject either to minimal standards like notification and transparency, or which are merely subject to voluntary regulation. So this is a very significant document, not just because it is near comprehensive as a scheme for the EU, or because it will have some extraterritorial effect, but because, as the title of today's talk suggests, it may well come to serve as a global framework, or at least part of a global framework for the regulation of AI. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome our main speaker today, who is Mrs. Eva Kaili. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2014. Among other things, she is chair of the European Parliament's Science and Technology Options Assessment Body, STOA. She has a background in engineering. She has worked as a journalist, and she has been described as the most popular Greek politician in the world. So it's a particular pleasure, Eva, to have you here today, especially on Ohi Day, the day that the Greeks stood up against fascist tyranny. So wonderful.
That's true.
And it's also extra benefit that you're from the same part of Greece as my parents, so you couldn't be more welcome. Our commentators are Carly Kind, who's director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. Carly is a human rights lawyer and a leading authority on the intersection of technology policy and human rights. And she was previously legal director of Privacy International. And our other commentator is Jeremias Adams-Prassel, who is a professor of law here at Oxford. He's based at Magdalen College and the Bonavero Institute. He leads a 5-year research project funded by a European Research Council grant exploring legal regulation of algorithmic management, i.e. being hired and fired by an algorithm. So I'm delighted we have such a wonderful speaker, two excellent commentators. As I say, we will have an opportunity for questions, both from the audience present here and via YouTube. But now I'm going to turn over to Eva, so when you're ready.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting, exactly the points that you highlighted. So we come from the same place, from Greece. And when I became a member of the European Parliament, I was trying to find solutions in our problems, the austerity measures and the collapse of our financial system. So I turned to the disruptive technologies, and I started working on blockchain. And later on, I took over the file, let's say, of artificial intelligence. So as I think all of you know, during the recent developments, we have a lot of advances in artificial intelligence. They are driven by also the availability we have in data, but also the computational power that has increased. We are investing a lot in supercomputers, and the technology now allows us to do a lot of processing of data to understand more complex systems. And I think everybody thought even AI was a vaccine that could get us out of this pandemic sooner. So they are trying to find a solution with AI on everything. I think AI is a very powerful technology. and we're trying to see the positive disruption. Today, unfortunately, I think I'm going to talk about the things we try to avoid with artificial intelligence and the work we've been doing in the European Parliament, and also I would say the public controversies about the benefits and the concerns for the concentration of power that it could lead to have to specific companies and the data owners, basically, that were not regulated the last at least 20 years. Inequality, increase of inequality and discrimination for violation of privacy and manipulation of perceptions, even the fear of losing our freedom to think of our thoughts. How much freedom of choice do we have? Is my newsfeed that manipulated that I don't see anything that somebody else sees? It's too personalized. So these are issues that we're trying to address several years now. I've been working around 5-6 years on artificial intelligence. And let me just say that I believe that we need to have regulation because legal certainty will allow, especially in Europe, to take the benefits of a big market with 27 member states, with 24 different languages and legal and tax systems. So we understand that for Europe it's necessary to do that and achieve to have a harmonized environment. So let me say that the 2016, I think you would remember there were like these pictures of should the robots be taxed. There was a discussion and it followed the resolution we had in the European Parliament to see if we should call for legislation for robotics. It followed the 2017 more comprehensive resolution, and we were calling the Commission to give us an ethical framework. I remember I was traveling a lot in the academia, especially in the US, I have to say, and scientists were warning me, if Europe doesn't do something, we will lose control of this technology, and they were more worried about autonomous weapons. So I went back and I said, we need to have an ethical framework. That was 2017. So we started with a high-level experts group. And it brought an initial, let's say, Magna Carta for AI ethics. There was a code for robotics engineers, for ethics committees, for research, a license agreement for designers, and a model license agreement for users. Now we have, basically, I also worked in 2019, so before we ended the first mandate that I was in the Parliament, by calling on this ethical framework to become law, European law, because it's not very easy to control this technology. And if we hadn't moved fast, now we wouldn't be talking about this possibility to have an artificial intelligence act that would decide a bit the liabilities and the high and low risk approach that you very well mentioned. At that point, and working always close to OECD, with OECD we established basically a strong partnership at the parliamentary level to work together on a human-centric and trustworthy AI. So we keep these words very strong in the core of our agenda. We're trying to set some ethical limits to the autonomy of AI and robotics as much as this is possible, and to safeguard transparency, bias, explainability of algorithms. So each word that I say, we still have to explore, if it's possible, how it can happen, and what is the methodology to achieve that, without creating more friction for the people that want to work with AI and for innovation to happen. I remember I also added a disclaimer saying that we have to have a switch off button, an emergency button, where if things go wrong, you are able to stop and take back control of an AI system, and that you also have the right to be offline. This year, the Parliament called for the right to disconnect. As you remember, with the pandemic, everybody was working crazy hours because everything was so fluid and uncertain, working from home, that there were no specific, rules that we should follow, and we had to translate our offline, basically, rules to the online world. And this is what we try to do, especially with AI. So since I'm in the UK, I have to say that in Europe, one difference that occurred recently is that you decided you don't want to have human oversight over AI systems. We still insist that we need to have human oversight and to have the right also to redress. So the question would be, can you blame the algorithm? I saw recently Boris Johnson blaming the algorithm for a failure at an AI system in grading a school or some exams or something. So we believe that there is always a human to be blamed and should be if something goes wrong, because they made the decision to use this algorithm. They chose the metrics, they chose which data sets they should collect and how. But of course, we have to understand also the limitations of our capacity to understand the black box, especially when you talk about deep learning, because scientists cannot understand in the end if the algorithm changes itself, how it happened and what happened. So Professor Tassioulas also joined us to the International Advisory Board of STOA, our scientific and technology panel, where we now try to connect with international organizations like OECD, IEEE, the Standards Association for Engineers, parentheses. So they are trying to conduct a code of conduct for engineers, which means when I ask an engineer to present an application, this engineer can by himself ensure that there will be ethics embedded, that he will take under consideration, for example, the driver, not just the company and the client, but also the person involved, which is not the case in several applications. So I want to move a bit more to tell you about this AI Act. I know that you are aware of it since you are here with us. But I would highlight the discussions we're having, and this can trigger, interesting debates. So it has a very interesting definition that it's quite, again, liquid. So we can change the definition because the technology is changing. And it's broad, it's trying to include everything. So from automation to autonomy, autonomous systems, statistical techniques, but also machine learning and hybrid systems. It has the ambition to harmonize the existing laws and hopefully stop other laws to come up and have like a European horizontal framework, and also to invest exactly in the priorities that we are going to set. And it also has an obligation for the high risk, especially applications, for the providers or the ones who who use the application, irrespective of whether they are established in or out of EU. So this is, I would say, the second time after GDPR that we are trying to set some rules globally. I remind you that scientists were telling me if Europe doesn't do it, nobody else will. So I think this is why we're trying to move a bit fast, and we are trying to solve a matrix through different committees, because AI is a layer that has to be addressed by several committees. So the risk-based approach is also very interesting, because we have to decide what's going to be a high-risk application and when is it considered to be harmful. So we have to define it, or we have to allow the definition to evolve also, and that would be interesting. Some initial thoughts we have, because the AI Act just arrived as a legal piece in the Parliament, which means now the committees will take it, and we're going to start debating and working on these specific issues. So, for example, AI that poses any minimal or high risk, for example, health, in health technology, those posing an acceptable risk. There are some banned completely applications. Facial recognition in public spaces. We decided we don't want to have that. Of course, the devil is in the details. So do we want it in private spaces? Do we want it at schools? This remains to be seen. But we don't want it in the public spaces at this point. Then we talk about manipulation of behavior. I spoke about it before. And this is, again, a bit blurry, because manipulation could happen also with targeted advertisement, which is, as you know, the business model of the biggest platforms, Facebook included. So we have to clarify what we mean with that. And of course, we mean also the deepfakes. So we have an obligation now for the creators of deepfakes to state that it is a deepfake. So you're talking to a bot, you are watching a video that is not real. Because imagine if we have elections and Saturday, you vote on Sunday, and Saturday you see me at a video with a synthetic me saying things that are unacceptable. And I cannot even prove it was not me, because they are so good and so perfect that scientists themselves and designers are telling us they are trying to find ways to identify deepfakes very fast, but it becomes more and more difficult. Then, of course, there are a lot of philosophical issues and debates that we could have about what if, since an algorithm is reading our patterns, what if we are trapped in this pattern and these biases are being circulated again, and it leads basically to an automation of inequalities. I think it happened also with this grading issue that you had. So it didn't consider in a human way to give another chance, to give the benefit of doubt. And these are issues that we need to ensure that they will be part of the metrics of any algorithmic system as much as we can embed ethics. Social scoring, again, is forbidden. Social scoring, not credit scoring, not scoring in general or ranking. But to use anything to discriminate or exclude is, again, something that violates the European values, which means there was a person that was looking online for a specific chronic disease, and she actually was looking it was about her family. But suddenly, a few weeks later, her insurance company stopped her contract. She connected the dots and she realized that they were part of the third parties that had access to those data of her Google search. So she was excluded from her insurance and she managed to get it back. But we understand that when we are on the internet, we release data that we don't even consider that somebody has access to that and is trying to make a profit from the understanding of our behavior. So I think we have to discuss again how we can include quality criteria or evaluate the data sets that feed the algorithms and decide if to read or even to predict by reading our emotional behavior is acceptable or not, in which case. So the purpose will be very, very important. And I think this is the first time European regulators attempt to define to have boundaries and limits that should not be crossed when we are deploying technology. So we're not trying to regulate the technology, the uses of the technology, but now it's happening in a massive level. And we're trying to have the high-risk approach, as we said, hopefully not to forbid, but to have a lot of safeguards as higher the risk. In critical infrastructures, when you use it in educational, employment, or emergency context, in asylum and border context, in social welfare, or for credit scoring, for law enforcement or judicial purposes. And the right to update this list constantly. So this is the initial list, but this is not the final list because, as I said, we need still to go through that. And I have a few minutes left just to say, because all of these things, they have some issues that we can really discuss and decide how we should proceed. We don't have conclusions yet, we just have the points that we need to address. We have to decide how smart we will allow it to be. Should it take over the boring and the dangerous jobs, or should artificial intelligence take the creative jobs or the jobs that make decisions? I think it's very important to decide if quality jobs should be allowed to be taken by artificial intelligence. I was a journalist, far behind, I don't even remember when, for a couple of years, for 3 years. And I remember we were meeting with all the journalists and trying to decide what the cover would be, what the first top story would be. Now it's been decided by an algorithm. And this is very important on Facebook, on Twitter, on WeChat, on several applications, and Google News, of course. So I think it's very important to understand that this technology can also change how our democracies work. We saw it with Cambridge Analytica, or we think it would be a possibility that Cambridge Analytica changed the result of the Brexit vote by targeting people that they were not decisive, and was so small the difference that it could have actually played a significant role there. So to understand the personalities and target them with specific content. Hopefully it was not the one that did that, but it could have been. So in the end, I think that to strike this balance between protecting citizens and also the investors or the ones that they want to benefit from artificial intelligence, it requires complex evaluations. It's not easy, and we need to be aware constantly. We need to acquire more digital skills to learn AI so that we are not controlled by AI. I think it's essential for everybody to have even minimum digital skills. to understand how this technology works. And our effort is to make sure that this technology will respect diversity, particularities of people, that they're not able to be at the maximum of their productivity, and not to allow Amazon to constantly or automatically, for example, fire somebody because there is an AI system that measures the productivity and you fail to increase it 1 week. I think I could continue, but I think you don't want me to. I'm not sure. So I just want to say one thing, and one example that could be maybe a good example. So TripAdvisor, do you use it? People here use it? Yes? Okay, half maybe. So I use it a lot before if I want to book a hotel or a restaurant. And I remember I was at a French restaurant. Everybody was very polite, and surprisingly. And I realized that since TripAdvisor had these like comments from people on the service, everybody tries to be more polite now. So it changed behaviors in a good way. And because this is a ranking that is very difficult to change. You have really to struggle if you have a lot of bad ranking. But you also understand that it's very difficult if somebody receives a massive attack that is organized to decrease his ranking, what's there. So we need to find these safeguards constantly with the new technologies. And we need to develop methodologies to help us also make these definitions. So what I can say and promise is we will be working on several files around AI, also the Data Act, how we can exchange data in a safe way, besides GDPR. Let's say the GDPR for the industry. We're working on the DSA and DMA. I think it's known, the obligations of the gatekeepers, and how much, let's say, target advertisement should be allowed to happen, if you should have an option to opt out, or at least to be warned. These are issues that we are discussing exactly at this point, and we are delaying a bit to conclude because we want to get it right, and we don't agree on everything. I would finish with that, and I would say that I'm now in UK for the first time after the Brexit. It was the pandemic immediately, actually. And I believe we definitely need to collaborate to have an international accord on artificial intelligence. This is a global technology. The US is more free into using data and capital for AI applications. China is more controlled by governments. I think Europe has the possibility to make AI complementary to citizens with high priority of principles and values that we have in the EU. So I will finish here because if you give politicians time, they can, abuse that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So there'll be time again for you to speak in response to the questions. So I'm now going to pass on to Jeremiah to give the first set of comments. When you're ready.
Thank you, John, and thank you for this really interesting overview. I should say right at the outset that even though I'm about to be very critical, none of this is to be taken as a suggestion that we don't need regulation of technology at the European level. I think for the reasons Eva's just given, I think both in terms of the fact that this is a global technology, no one country can try and tackle this by itself, but also for the broader geopolitical reason that actually in terms of different regulatory approaches, I think the European approach to AI has the unique feature of thinking both about the need for having the internal market, for having innovation, for actually thinking about how we can break down regulatory borders, whilst also having a very deep commitment to fundamental rights protection and looking at the various immaterial and material harms that technology can give rise to. So I think for all those reasons, I think we do need regulation at the European level. What I'm afraid to say is we don't need that particular regulation that's currently proposed. What I want to focus on in particular, amongst the broader regime, is what's technically referred to as Title III. So that is the regulation of high-risk contexts in which artificial intelligence can be deployed. And by the way, when we talk of artificial intelligence here, we talk about just about anything that involves maths or statistics in any way, shape or form. The scope of the Act, both in substance and in geography, is incredibly, incredibly broad. And so what the Act does, and what again, to my heart initially was very positive, very surprising, it recognises that there are certain contexts in which the deployment of artificial intelligence can be particularly risky. Public services, the health sector, my particular area of interest, the world of work, various forms of automating the exercise of traditional managerial functions. And so when you first look at the AI Act, you think this is great, finally a recognition that we need to be very careful about deploying AI in these systems, and also at first glance, actually a pretty long list of pretty nice substantive standards in terms of documentation, in terms of the bias freeness of the data, in terms of record keeping, really thinking through the obligations. But when you start digging deeper into the Act, both from sort of the internal structure of the Act, but also with my hat as sort of EU constitutional lawyer on, you quickly start realizing that it doesn't just do what it says on the tin. Instead, John was talking earlier about the twin dangers of both over and under regulating. And what I'm worried about is that the AI Act, as it's proposed at the moment, manages to do both. It manages both to massively under-regulate at the European level and massively to over-regulate what will happen in the member states. So very quickly, let me just show you both of those things, both those dangers I'm worried about. So let's start with the internal operation of the Act, where I think there's massive under-regulation. Because when you start looking into what's actually going on, and you need to go quite far, sort of, section 60 onwards, most people, even lawyers, I'm afraid to say, have usually stopped reading by that point.
50 page.
But what starts to happen, you discover that actually the EU hasn't invented a new regulatory regime. The GDPR, that was genuine innovation when it came to regulation. For AI regulation, what the union has taken on is product regulation. So this face mask as PPE is regulated by the European Union. There's a product standard laid down somewhere, usually by a private standard setting body, that says, here's the various rules to make a face mask. And then the producer of the face mask self-certifies compliance with the standard and gets to print the little CE label on this. Doesn't matter whether you're talking forestry vehicles, chainsaws, PPE, etc. The EU has been incredibly successful at using this technique where you essentially get rid of public discussion and devolve standard setting to private bodies in areas where it's not controversial. Because ultimately, democratic accountability doesn't matter when it comes down to laying down standards for chainsaws or PPE. The big concern is using the same regulatory approach when it comes to regulating artificial intelligence. Because artificial intelligence is not a widget. It's not something where we can ex ante lay down the standards we need to comply with. It's not something where ex ante we know exactly what it will be, it never changes, and also, crucially, the harms, and again, actually the proposal recognises this, the harms are not just material harms. The CE regime, or the new legislative framework, even though it's from the 70s, as it's technically called, is designed to prevent us as European consumers from physical harms. Whereas the kind of harms we're looking at in the artificial intelligence context go far beyond that, and are essentially non-material harms, fundamental rights violations. And so really question whether that regime of private standard setting, of self-certification, of really first and foremost looking for material harms can actually work. Again, I think Kaili we've cheated and coordinated a bit. I think you'll talk about this a bit more. Another big problem is that the consumer doesn't really play a role in this new legislative framework. So again, whereas under the GDPR, the individual citizen has rights, under the framework as kind of proposed, she has no way of actually enforcing any of this, no access to the standards. Okay, so you could say that's the internal problem. Fair enough, it's going to be another piece of regulation that's not going to achieve very much. And it's interesting indeed when you talk to people in Brussels at the moment, there's surprisingly little opposition from industry to this measure, which again might have you potentially concerned about it. But that's not the thing I'm really worried about. The thing I'm really worried about is, and this is a tiny bit boring constitutional, but really, really important from a societal perspective, so bear with me, is the legal basis that was used for this proposal. That's Article 114 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which gives the Union a really important residual power to regulate the internal market. And usually it is used for what we call maximum harmonization. Maximum harmonization, again, I'm simplifying a bit here, but essentially what it means is that we've got one centralized standard and individual member states are not allowed to lay down any other standards in the field that's occupied by the Union at that point. So essentially, once Union law has occupied the territory, member states can't do anything further in that field. And the real problem is that that's fine with products. Again, just regulating what my face mask is one thing. Recognizing to some extent that AI is not just a widget, but slightly more than that. The current proposal regulates not just a standard for AI as a product, but also its usage, which suddenly means, when we're talking maximum harmonization, that any domestic law which in any way, shape or form interferes or regulates the use of AI would suddenly become illegal under the basic doctrine of the supremacy of EU law. So if you imagine, say, a Swedish hypothetical law on the carbon impact of artificial intelligence would be illegal. You imagine current German, Austrian rules on co-determinations where workers through their works council have a right to speak about and potentially veto the introduction of new technologies in the workplace. Illegal. You think about the recently proposed and I think 2 days ago now enacted Spanish law on algorithmic transparency for gig economy workers. Again, illegal under this particular measure. So that, I think, is the real worry here. This use of Article 114 of maximum harmonization as a way that means that whatever we've got at the European level, and you might have gathered by now that I'm not particularly happy with what's happening at the European level, that very low-level regulation then suddenly becomes not just the floor of rights, but actually the ceiling, and no member state can do anything further. So yes, absolutely, I think we need European regulation, both in terms of having the Brussels effect, both in terms of having this really important sense of we can regulate both for innovation and for the protection of fundamental rights, but we should be really, really careful about using product regulation, regulating the use, and then using maximum harmonization.
Excellent. AI is not a widget. Product regulation is not the appropriate paradigm. Kaili.
Thank you so much. So I think it's been a good order so far because I'm going to go even one level deeper and go into a little bit more of some of the details. But before I do that, so I'm the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, and we're a research institute with a focus on the impact of AI on people and society. And I think we're positioned around issues like this in a very pragmatic way, which is that we want to try and make this better. And so we're engaging with the regulation from the perspective of how might we help those in Brussels and elsewhere improve the regulation to have maximum effect with a view to protecting people and benefiting society. So we're really interested in the distributional impact of AI and how do we make sure there's equitable distribution of the benefits of AI amongst all groups. So we look a lot, for example, at inequalities and how AI might disadvantage particular groups. And we have 2 forthcoming reports that might be of interest. One, we'll have a policy position paper on the regulation within the next few weeks. And the other is next week we're publishing a report called Regulate to Innovate, which is about the UK AI strategy and how the UK government might think about regulation in light of the AI strategy that was published a couple of weeks ago, and also in light of the Brussels regulation, where the UK might position itself on some of these issues of regulation. In a way, this is a potential opportunity for the UK to craft its own approach to regulation. We expect the Brussels trilogues may take a couple of years to really iron out the kinks in the regulation. I suppose if we believe the hype around Brexit, one of the benefits was meant to be that we could potentially legislate more quickly outside of Brussels. So perhaps AI is the domain in which that might happen. And I think particularly thinking about the potential Brussels effect of this regulation, without a doubt, and if every country will have to standardise with what the EU does here. So kind of as was alluded to, there's an interesting kind of geopolitical angle. Someone mentioned China as well. China's recently published a code on algorithmic recommendations itself. So there are other codified effects, regulations being published elsewhere outside of the EU, and I think this is going to be, in a way, a kind of race to see who can nail down the framework first, and then others will have to kind of fall in line. But our perspective, similar to what Jeremiah was saying, is that this is a very impressive attempt to bring regulation to a space that I think people, even a year ago were saying it can't be done, or at the very least we shouldn't try yet. We don't really know enough about what AI is yet, and certainly the idea of horizontal application of regulation felt like it wasn't the right approach. There was very much this sense that let's just go sectorally when it comes to regulation and governance. And I think that the fact that the EU has attempted it has actually shifted the Overton window quite a lot when it comes to AI regulation. We now have a proposal on the table, and that's quite exciting because it gives us a chance to really think about cause and effect when it comes to regulation, and actually how do you look at the detail of law in the context of technology. So really taking what were previously amorphous concepts of ethics and trustworthiness and really saying how do you put them into practice. So I'm going to focus on 6 or 7 critiques that we have of the regulation, or things we're focusing on thinking about how you improve. So the first is that the risk-based approach that the regulation adopts, in that it says, here are some prohibited systems, here are some high-risk systems, here are some medium-risk systems, and everything else is unregulated. That is centred on the idea of what the intended use of the system is. So a system is categorised as high risk if its intended use is in one of 9 domains, or it's a safety component. And I think let's put the safety components aside for a second. We can probably all agree that it's pretty clear which, if you've got an AI system in flying an aeroplane, that should be considered a high-risk system. But for the purpose of, for example, law enforcement, you're talking about this definition which says technologies or AI systems which have as their intended use law enforcement become a high-risk system. And I think that as a starting point for us is problematic, because oftentimes systems are used outside of their intended use, and sometimes that isn't foreseeable by the developer of the system, and sometimes it is. And I think there are uses across categories when it comes to AI. So a really simple example recently was that there was a news item about the Home Office using Facebook targeted ads to get to migrants, right? That wouldn't be captured by the regulation. And we might not think it's a high-risk application of AI, maybe it's a medium risk, but I think it's clear that there will be a range of unintended uses of AI which might fall through the gaps in this system. And so there's a question about how you use regulation to capture not only intended but foreseeable uses, I suppose. And this is something that is done in other regulatory regimes. So you can think about the medical devices regulation approach in the US, for example. Under the FDA, they do manage to capture both intended and foreseeable uses, so that might be something that could be brought in here. There's also a set of criteria in the regulation already which says here's how we might create new categories of high risk, and it's quite a good set of criteria. It says things like, has this system caused harm? Is it specifically being used against vulnerable people? Is the outcome of the system difficult to reverse? So there are some general criteria about how you add new sets of high-risk systems. So a different approach might be all systems are on the table, we assess all of them against this criteria, and then we work out if they're high risk or not. A second set of concerns are around future-proofing the regulation. At the moment, as Jeremiah said, argued well, this is very much approaching AI as a product. And we see a big emerging market around AI as a service. So there's obviously lots of already services out there where you can essentially tap into a generalized AI model to develop your own particular product. And large language models, general purpose models are going to be hugely influential, and they will be governed by very few actors because the kind of network effects and investment to create a general large language model is huge, but that would be uncaptured by this regulation. And the only way that it might be captured is if the users of the system, the procurers, the buyers, make substantial modifications to the AI service that they acquire. Then they take on some new responsibilities. But actually, most AI as a service is not about making substantial modifications. It's about using the model and then just implementing it in your own application. So that feels like it's a big gap, actually, which means the regulation won't be future-proofed. Lots has been said about the prohibited system, so I won't go into that. The only thing to say is they feel quite selective in that there's 4 prohibited systems. It's a bit of a question of why these 4, why not other 4? And even the ones that are there, there's been lots talked about around biometrics and facial recognition. The prohibitions in there are very narrowly drawn. And I'm not necessarily arguing they should be more widely drawn, but it feels a bit arbitrary to say, okay, we're going to prohibit the use of facial recognition in public spaces for crimes that are less serious than terrorism, for example. Whereas things like the that prohibition wouldn't capture the use of biometrics for classification as opposed to identification. So this idea that you might use a facial recognition system to see who's walking suspiciously through a crowded public place, which is, providers of facial recognition or gait recognition software, say, is feasible, that's not captured in the prohibition category. So they feel perhaps the critique is that they feel a bit outdated or are just responding to things that are currently of concern or in the news rather than really kind of future-proofing the regulation. And then I think there's a separate conversation about does it make sense to prohibit systems at all. The role of standards bodies, Jeremiah's touched on a little bit. I would say only that the standards bodies, European standards bodies, play a big role under this regulation. Standards bodies generally are heavily criticised for being very largely captured by industry actors, and there's very little ability for civil society to be involved in influence standards bodies. The kind of price of admission is very high. And I think that raises the risk that they will develop standards that don't have a full comprehensive view of the range of risks that might arise with AI systems. They also feel much more suited for thinking about safety in the AI context, safety, assurance, validation, which is a very different set of issues to fundamental rights. And fundamental rights themselves don't lend themselves very well to the development of specific standards that are kind of laid down in stone. That, you know, the whole body of human rights law is really an iterative one, which is based on how things change over time. So it's really hard to see how fundamental rights become enshrined in technical standards. And I'd say linked to that is this concern that Jeremiah's made around self-certification. We know that self-regulation hasn't worked well in other aspects of the tech sector. It doesn't feel like it's going to work particularly well here. If we look again at other regulatory models, like the FDA in the US, for high-risk systems, the FDA actually has to sign off on the tech before it's allowed to be deployed. And the developers have to show that they've been subject to randomized control trials. So there's quite a high barrier to entry into the market. Now, we can argue about whether that's feasible when it comes to AI, and it may not be, but self-certification feels quite a long way from that. I think I've spoken enough, so I'll stop there.
That's fantastic. I'm actually going to take the liberty of making a short comment myself, because I think it connects up with some of the things you were saying, Kaili, and Eva knows this comment from me, if she reads my emails. But the point is that it is an interesting feature of this, this proposed regulation, that it calibrates the degree of regulation to the degree of risk. And that sounds extremely rational, I think. But then the question is, how do you pursue that objective? And it seems to me the method that's adopted is a list-based approach. So you list certain areas of activity, and you say, if AI systems are operating in this domain of activity, then they attract the higher level of regulation that comes with being high risk. Otherwise, they take on a very minimal form of regulation, even potentially just self-regulation. My difficulty is I don't think that this is a principled approach, and it's not really possible a priori to identify the areas where there are high risks. So take one example. Under the heading of essential public services, one of the activities identified is dispatching emergency first response services, including firefighters and medical aid. And you could see that if you had an algorithm that systematically discriminated against women or black people in the dispatch of such services, that is a very serious matter. But the question is, I can imagine very serious threats to people's rights in medical contexts outside of dispatching immediate sort of emergency services. So say you had a doctor, a GP, who used some AI tool to determine priority for making appointments, and it systematically discriminated against women, or it systematically discriminated against black people, etc. You can come up with your own examples. Think of a fun fair that uses a way of admitting people, but it systematically discriminates against black children. Now, these, to me, are very serious harms. They're not like product-related harms of the kind you're talking about, but they could be deeply scarring for someone being subject to that kind of discrimination. Now, the answer is, if that happens, we'll add those to the list. We'll create but now the point is, well, on what basis are you adding them to the list? You must have a principled basis for adding them to the list. Well, if the principle is doing the work, why not enunciate the principle in the regulation rather than do these ad hoc moves retrospectively? So I guess the point is, if you're going to go down the EU Napoleonic, we're going to have this code created in advance, it seems to me the benefit of doing that, it's a highly principled approach. You've enunciated principles that can then be internalized by agents who act on those principles. But this way, you have the a priori approach, but it's all based on ad hoc moves. And I think that's kind of problematic. But on the other side, perhaps this is a pragmatic compromise to negotiate the balance between under and over regulation. So I'm not suggesting this is an easy area. Eva, we're going to turn over to you for, I mean, obviously there's so many things that have been said. Don't feel obliged to respond to everything, but what you want to respond to.
Yeah, no, first of all, nothing is illegal yet because the act doesn't exist. So what you suggested is not what's going to happen. There would be a possibility that if you have a strong European law that is too specific, then you would have problems with member states, but usually it's quite broad and it doesn't influence, it takes under consideration the national laws, and then you have the time either to adapt or to basically change it and match it to your national systems, like we did with GDPR, which was attacked because it was too blurry and allowed this to happen. So your comments are very interesting to take under consideration, but you take for granted that this is going to be the final text, and it's not, it just arrived. So it's going to be taken by several committees, the industry committee, the healthy environment, the employment, liberties, legal committees. So everything will change, and problems like that will be discussed in detail. But let me just say something. So, of course, it's going to be principle-based, and that's why we don't have a specific list. It can be updated. And I said in my speech that there has to be a methodology developed to understand how, if you use an artificial intelligence system or an algorithm, where you're going to end up, being overregulated or not. In the end, the response that could answer all the questions is that we know what we want to achieve. What we want to achieve is to translate properly our offline rules to the online world, so to be able to protect our fundamental rights. Maybe one thing that we might disagree a bit, and I know UK is trying to find good reasons for the Brexit. Maybe you don't have yet, but we'll try to not give you more. So, because we would like you to come back. But I think we don't believe that, we and I specifically, I would say especially I'm of the party of the Socialists and Democrats, we are very strong into privacy, and we don't like mass surveillance, and we don't want to break encryption, we don't want to have backdoors, and this is why sometimes we have big discussions and we delay with our legislation. So we are very sensitive with privacy. We think it's a right that we should not abandon to be safe with AI systems or smart systems. Not that we don't want to be safe. We want to have the balance. So we believe you can be safe, you can use the maximum benefits of an AI system, while your privacy also can be respected. For example, there are systems that they can identify an attack without reading the content. So we can use those systems. The problem is that we don't have too many, perhaps, legislators or policymakers that understand the technology in depth and the possibilities, and they don't think this is possible. So they think there has to be a way to read the photograph or the content that's being shared to make sure that there will not be a case where a trafficking system, will go and benefit from the encryption. But there are ways to figure it out. Actually, most of the terrorist attacks, they are people that they are on lists of high-risk suspects, correct? So they are being, in any case, followed. And through the metadata, if we want to be honest, actually there's no real privacy besides the content. So with the metadata, I would say if you have the location, the time, the frequency of communication, you can make very interesting conclusions. You can target somebody as a consumer, as a client, as a person, as a worker, as an activist. So you can actually get a lot of information from the metadata that telecom companies have, and everybody who has a device gives away, and it's not covered by GDPR. So I would say that in the end, if we agree that we want to have a balance, to be able to use all the benefits of artificial intelligence, but we know that companies, they want to get more, they want to make more, and we want to have the difference of the mentality of EU is that we prioritize the benefit of the people. And I will agree with one thing, that we should not create frictions, or we should not reduce the possibility of AI to achieve things. I agree, and I love to say that people should have options. So I want to give more options. But I want to have these options. And if the option is that I want by default to not be targeted by advertisements, I want to be able to have this option. And if I want my microphone, because now it's not off. I'm not recording, but it's not off. Why? Because I don't have the option. When you're using an Uber application, if you would have Uber here, which you didn't, and I realized, that's why I was late, I would have said that I would go in the settings and I would choose check my location while using the app, always, or not at all. I have to do it every time, or allow once. So this is a choice I have for my location and this specific application. Do I have the same choice for my microphone? No. Do I have it for my camera? No. So if it's on, to use Messenger, it's always on, the camera too. And make a very easy example to understand what it means. I was talking about, with a friend of mine, he was talking actually about cars, and I was receiving advertisements about like Range Rover things and stuff like that. It was not me Google searching. I didn't write anything on my phone. It was just listening to my conversation, and they targeted me with advertisements. And it was not that smart, right? So I realized it was coming after this discussion. So I would like to give people these options. And I believe most of my colleagues, this is what we want to achieve, to give options. But still, you were talking about the products and the mask, and I was thinking, we are in Europe and we feel comfortable to use all these products because we believe that there is somebody making sure that they are what they say they are, that somebody is doing like tests and quality controls. So we use this device and we know it's not going to explode, or we use a charger and we know it's not going to burn out. We trust that machines, products, services, they are trustworthy. So if we know where we're going to get, I think we're going to manage to achieve that. I agree it's complicated. Again, we have different languages, legal systems, tech systems, and this is a technology that goes beyond borders. So at least you saw that we have started now the Trade and Technology Council with the United States. I believe that starting to discuss between democracies, a democratic alliance, on how we should use technologies and decide minimum standards, this would really be useful to avoid the problems that you mentioned, that if they are also in the final text, they will be there. So I can definitely agree to that. I'm just telling you that these are all the things that we should discuss. I already understand that we need to have methods for those issues. We need to understand the purpose for each application, and we cannot stop AI from providing us from solutions. What perhaps we can discuss is that since AI and the definition is so broad, let's try to work with different definitions and decide how much autonomy we want to give to the systems. Because now when we talk about AI, it's basically statistical processes that would give you the best possible result, or they will give you a solution on an equation, let's say. But once it becomes autonomous, so you give the right to the AI to make a decision, and then you embed it in a robot, and then they can act without human oversight or interface, then you have challenges like the autonomous vehicles, and this is where the machines have to be super safe before we allow them to be out there. I believe we all want that, and yes, it is also geopolitical, because these machines, if you want to access a huge market, it's better if we have clear rules and we agree at least at the minimum standards, so that we can have the benefits very fast. Again, we saw that with the pandemic. We saw what happened with the supply chains. They were disrupted. Safety equipment was not reaching the country that was in great need because of different standards or issues at the border control. So to benefit us all, we need to end this act. At least there is an effort there. Huh? So we are talking about that. And I saw that I followed Professor Tassoulias, your discussions here, and they're very useful to us, because we understand what are the topics you highlight, and I see a lot of references to what Europe has brought to the table. So everything you mentioned is food for thought. I took my notes.
Fantastic. So this is very familiar territory now for academics, because you're saying the Act is a bit like someone's draft article, which has not yet been published. And now there's a chance for feedback from the audience to help improve things.
That's
so
true.
can I invite anyone who has questions?
See, yes, I was planning to give you my glass.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting and really good to hear the feedback as well. So my question is what the Act is trying to regulate that doesn't currently fall within the scope of law, which is perhaps inadequate or maybe more likely inadequately enforced. So I think a lot of the issues that have been raised are issues that already fall within the data protection sphere, for example, or within the sphere of privacy law, or perhaps in the examples that John raised in the sphere of equality law. And just thinking on one example of a case in the UK that went to the Court of Appeal, which was about biometric facial recognition used by the police. There were two arguments made in that case by the NGO that brought it. One was an equality and public law argument, basically saying that the police hadn't complied with their public sector equality duty, which is a UK duty on public sector bodies to consider equality impacts when they make decisions. And the second argument was a data protection argument that they hadn't carried out their impact assessment adequately in terms of considering equality impacts. And when I went to the court, they basically focused massively on the first limb, the public sector equality duty, and less so on the data protection limb. And probably because this is an area, this issue about equality is an area in which we already have old EU laws on discrimination. And we now also have a new framework on data protection, which perhaps covers some of the ground in the AI Act. So I'm just wondering whether there are particular harms that are not currently addressed, and where the issue isn't just underfunding of our regulators, like data protection authorities and equality bodies. What are we trying to do that's new? And I know you mentioned about weapons, obviously that's kind of outside of the EU's competence, but what are the kind of issues that really inspired you to want to bring a new piece of legislation as opposed to bolstering existing legislation and existing regulators?
So can I just summarize for the benefit of people on YouTube? So I think this is a really important question. This is a quasi-comprehensive code, but what is the value added that it's bringing over and above existing laws regarding data protection, regarding protection of equality? So there must be a kind of rationale for this extra layer of regulation. What is it catching that isn't already being caught?
Well, first of all, GDPR protects only sensitive data, not the rest. And we're expecting not just the AI Act, the Data Act is going to bring some rules for the use of industrial data or public generated data. And this will be super useful because we will know what we are able to share, under which conditions, for researchers, for science, for small companies to improve competition and to have a better ecosystem between entrepreneurs. They are excluded from the big data owners, and we want to change that. So GDPR doesn't cover everything, only the sensitive data. I already said that the metadata, they are not there. So there is a huge amount of data that we need to be able to understand how we can use them, how we can have the benefits of those, to have some common standards on how to collect them. And I'll give you an example. The first month, 2 months, I think, of the pandemic, when we were locked down, we had a discussion with ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. They had access to 80% of the data from hospitals, doctors, research institutions, governments, media around the pandemic, but different standards, which means it was like 80% of data that they couldn't actually use, different languages, different ways to collect them. We understand the need to have easy to use data for researchers to understand the pattern of the disease, how it's being used. If they are collected in the same way, then we would understand faster what we should be aware of. So this is just an example on what we need to do more. It's not there yet, unfortunately. Then we want to be more proactive about the development of these technologies, because we understand AI as automation, but predictive policing is not being addressed by any law. Using and exchanging data to reduce your credit score, like to make it impossible for you to get a loan, is not addressed. You have to be aware that this is happening to be able to do something about it. Transparency, you don't even have transparency to understand how your data are being used or reused. And again, not just sensitive data, that they are there to be protected by GDPR. Only when you realize that something is wrong, they have to enforce GDPR. It doesn't mean that everybody is respecting GDPR. So what we want to do is to make sure that there's going to be a monitoring and a proactive approach during the whole life cycle of the AI systems, because we believe that they could really be harmful applications, and we understand that not everybody has good intentions. There are companies, they want to benefit, they want to maximize profit, exclusion will happen. We know inequality will happen. We know that if you have a bad ranking and you cannot have a second chance to let's say, maybe even erase your data and start over, you might be excluded from ever working again as a driver. Because automatically the algorithm that fired you will never allow you to be rehired. So we don't have enough protection for these people. Case by case, they're trying to win. We know what is illegal offline, and we want to have it illegal online. But these new technologies, they can actually bring many more challenges on the table, and this is why we don't even understand yet. I mean, this is why this act is going to be changing a lot, and it leaves open the possibility to change this list when we decide the methodology to conduct this list, of course. So I don't know if I responded, but ILO, the International Labour Organization, said that with AI, we're going to have inequalities, lack of digital skills and understanding. And a lot of people don't have the same understanding with you. They don't understand when they see something, how they're being targeted, or what they should do to change something. We need to be able to predict also, to be not smarter than AI, but at least to understand how we can still keep controlling technologies.
Yeah, that's very compelling. So you're saying that, in effect, there are kind of new harms, but also old harms, which we wouldn't know happened because of the AI system prevents you from knowing that you're actually being victimized. This can preempt some of these. Can I ask two questions from the YouTube? So one is just a very quick one, just for clarification. Just to explain, this is from Richard Reinhold, why there's the military exclusion, which I assume has a very simple answer. And then another question from George Evangelinos says, do we need a form of universal declaration of human rights for legislating AI? Do we need some new digital rights, AI-related rights? And I'd like all three of you actually maybe to talk about that, but Eva, do you want to begin?
We don't invest into research for autonomous lethal weapons. So this is a decision we can have because we are investing now into building a more, let's say, European defense. And this is going to be the priority of the French presidency, which starts in January and ends in July. So in any case, we don't have a common European defense in our foreign policy. And this means we still try to coordinate our capacities. And this is why it's not easy to do that. But by principle, and once we start to discuss about that, and we are starting to discuss about that, we don't want to get there. And it's very interesting to think that actually we might have to, because you also need to create, we will have in our working program the next 6 months, Cyber Resilience Act, which means basically cyber defense. And this means we need to be able to defend ourselves from similar attacks. So you have, in the end, to explore and research these kind of technologies to be able to protect yourself from the ones that they will own it and they are not in the EU.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the human rights?
Yeah, yes, yeah. So I would say, to the extent that the question implies that we need new rights on the same footing as existing human rights, my personal view is that we do not need that. And that's primarily because to suggest that we can just add rights to the set of international human rights that have been long recognised undermines the legitimacy of those existing rights. The idea that we've just plucked them out of thin air and that they can change and be added to and subtracted from, I think, is quite concerning. I think the idea of opening up for political negotiation, something like the EDHR, would be very frightening. But I do think that we need new ways to understand trade-offs and particularly balancing of rights. We need new ways to understand where there's overlapping consensus about particularly difficult applications of existing human rights standards. And so, I don't have a problem in people saying we need a right to be forgotten as long as we're not saying let's elevate that to the same level as the right to life. I think that, I do think in the work that we do with publics, and we do at the A. Lovelace Institute, we do quite a lot of public engagement, people like the idea of a right as something that they can hold on to and invoke. And so it may be a useful tool to talk about rights or things that can empower people. They feel like that's something that they can hold on to. But from a legal perspective, I wouldn't.
You don't think there should be a right to a human decision in certain areas, really impactful decisions like being sentenced to imprisonment?
I suppose my opinion is that could be factored into existing rights and standards, existing human rights standards.
But I sense a sort of worry that opening up this issue at a time of populism might not lead to the results.
I suppose I've done quite a lot of work at the UN in kind of a campaigning or influencing perspective, and I can see that when you open up these issues, they do get subject to, the idea that we ever had consensus at a political level on human rights is amazing. I don't think we should try and reopen it because it doesn't feel like we'd reach the same point ever again.
And also, I think that's a really important point there. So I would say that, and I think we might actually, our intuitions, I think, might align there. It's like, yes, absolutely, there should be a right not to be subject to automated decision-making, but do we necessarily need to take that right and strap it onto the normative superstructure of human rights? Right? And so they're the much broad, you can have certain legal rights. They don't necessarily need to be human rights in that broad overarching.
But what I'm not understanding is the thought of having your life taken away from you by an automated decision-making process does seem to me like a human rights matter.
But
so why
you could argue that, but that would engage your Article 2 rights anyways, right? And the point is, I think, the whole point of the baseline of universal rights is that actually whether it's technology doing this or the police knocking a door in the middle of the night,
Sure. I mean, that's true. You could reconfigure existing rights to add new content. And so some of this might just be semantic.
I can add a right that it doesn't exist and it should exist. It's proposed by actually several colleagues in other continents, the right for to control your neurons. So basically to make sure that nobody would take control of your body, because we start to have a lot of research in implants. And this means when you are having Neuralink, the company of Tesla, of Elon Musk, Tesla's also, when they start investing into technologies that they can connect human brains to computers, this can go in two ways. And he's a biologist, and he considers that it's necessary to establish immediately the right to our neurons to control them. And I really think it's indeed very dangerous to open up the discussion, but the world is changing, and we need to add or broaden or create maybe a different level of digital rights, but the rights to have an offline life and not to be discriminated for that, or to disconnect while everybody wants you constantly to be connected, or the right to redress. I think there are significant rights that we don't have. And we would need to discuss.
But just on that point, again, the article, is it 19.2, which is not only freedom of information, but freedom of consciousness, would actually, there's been already lots of writing which says that right extends to your right to form an opinion independently of being influenced by media, social media, for example. So
part of this could be semantic, but So one of the problems happening with human rights discourse is a tendency to then inflate existing rights. So if you look at the general comment on the right to life, no one ever thought that the right to life included a huge range of socioeconomic rights, but that's what now the general comment says. So in response to your reservations, why do we need it? Because it's already included. Answer is, that's how human rights has gone. Human rights has gone down the pathway of having these very capacious rights where there's huge overlap between distinct rights. So the overlap doesn't seem to be an argument against introducing new rights, because you've already lost that argument. I think we need to sort of move on. Michael, you had a question?
Just one quick question. I wanted to go back to the very insightful remark in which you said, what is AI? Is it a product? And you said, it isn't a product. So what is it? And what regulatory model would follow if product regulation isn't the right model?
So I think there are lots of easy ways in which you can say here are the distinctions between a product and AI, right? I mean, there are elements of product regulation that would work, for example, in terms of initial specification. But the whole fact that it can evolve, it can change. Again, some products do, they don't. I think the key issue here is that we don't have an existing regulatory regime for something that's increasingly becoming an omnibus technology, right? And I think this is the point, particularly when you look at the scope provisions of the AI Act, where, we've discussed this with Mike and various of his computer science colleagues. Essentially, the current scope definition is if it involves even a low degree of statistics, it'll be AI and covered for purpose of that act. And so actually that was the one thing I was going to say earlier as well to John's sort of broad response. Do we need some sort of overarching regime? Maybe the solution to all of this is actually to abandon the omnibus regulatory approach. Yep. To say we're going to have one regime that regulates all of AI. When we're looking at because no one's ever sat down and saying we're going to have one regime that regulates electricity. Right? Nobody says, and even if we have certain technical standards for electricity, we don't then say any use of electricity is suddenly completely regulated by a single instrument. It's actually a sectoral approach or a principalist approach, but actually I think that's sort of moving away from an omnibus regime. So that might be the answer to that particular issue.
I think that's like the deep methodological question that the Act raises, why you think this is a discrete subject area with its own distinct set of principles, going back to Ashlyn's point. But I know Mike has strong views about the definition of AI in this Act. So,
so I should start by just saying I feel very sorry for you because, essentially you've come in the room with this big document and whatever, as John said, the academic response to that is to get out your red pen and start putting big sort of crosses. So I should also say, by the way, that I think in my community, which is the AI community, I think the overwhelming view is regulation is needed. The problem is exactly finding, as Jeremiah said, finding out exactly what the right mechanism for doing that. So Jeremiah's mentioned exactly the issue that you've raised, which is how do you define the thing that you're about to try to regulate? I think the current formulation is just not fit for practice, I think, for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, as Jeremiah's hinted, it's very, very, very broad. It covers, basically it says any statistical techniques that you use. If you eliminate any statistical techniques in your computer programs, that's pretty much everything goes out of the window. It's hidden away. Also, it's very easy to obfuscate what you're doing. Neural networks, which is the big AI technology of the day, what are neural networks? They're linear algebra. They're just, they're very simple sets of mathematical equations which you manipulate in certain ways. And it's not that hard to obfuscate them, to hide what you're doing. So I think there are a bunch of issues there, and I think it will be very easy to disguise what you're doing as this is not AI, this is just a regular program. Final point. I think when I'm concerned about all the issues that the proposed regulation raises, which I am concerned about just as much as anybody is, actually I'm not concerned about whether it's a neural network that's doing surveillance or manipulating my beliefs or manipulating my behaviour. What I care about is that it's algorithms that are doing that. It's automation that's doing that, and it's the distinction between somebody trying to persuade me in a debate in the pub about whether I should vote for Brexit or not, and being manipulated by an algorithm. And so I think it's not so much AI should be the focus, so much as algorithmic. The focus on algorithms and automation that's there.
We're running out of time, Eva, but I want to give you a few minutes to respond to that or anything else that's come up.
Yeah, no, I will agree because we are still working on the definition again. But in the end, it's a program, it's a software, it's an algorithm. It's created by humans. It's not perfect. It could create better results in some cases than we do. But we have to test this technology and make sure it actually works and it's beneficial. So what we're trying to achieve is to make it less harmful for people. It's not that we're trying to control the technology. So there is a principle in Europe, like 3 principles basically. We have to be tech neutral, business neutral, and innovation friendly. So we're not touching that technology, but the uses of the technology per sector, and we will have different other metrics to be able to achieve that. I believe that the way we're going to do that is going to make it better for scientists actually because it's going to provide legal certainty. It's going to help the engineers to be able to have the ethical code that they want embedded in their systems. And it's not just an algorithm, it's not just an equation with metrics. And metrics is quite political, and we also have to be able to say what kind of metrics should or shouldn't be, or perhaps should by default be taken under consideration. But we have to understand that it's a technology that with deep learning, it can change and be out of the control of human control. And we have to consider if we want to have that. So in the end, we are trying to have control of a technology that could create really a world that is not going to be fair, or it's going to create bigger inequalities than we used to. This is an ongoing effort. It's not going to be easy because this technology is developing. The same thing would go for blockchain. It's a technology. Everybody thought it was a solution for everything. In the end, it's a technology that we still need to make sure that we will use it to achieve specific tasks, but we also have to invest in specific applications. We have to say that we want to ban specific scams, because also it would protect consumers, users, but also the investors themselves from being misled by the ones that use this technology. Let me just say that I've been watching 6 years ago the Netflix series Black Mirror, and I thought there were like technologies that don't exist. Then I realized that everything exists. Everything is a possibility. And then I saw what China is doing with social scoring. And I saw that people are excluded from using the public transportation because of the ranking, because they don't like the government much, or because they uploaded a photograph from like a square where they protested against the government. So this is a society that we don't want to see. And AI could actually, in several ways, create the path to a society like this, because you cannot always understand how it works. So we want to be proactive. We want to do something good. We don't like to, I don't like to enter. The first time I entered, not the AI discussion, but the blockchain discussion, I was the one politician, 500 men. Everybody disliked me just because I was a politician, because they thought I was there to regulate and I was there to ban it or something. And I was there actually to learn, to understand, and in the end to help innovation to happen, to get great solutions. And they reached the level where they said, listen, we need to have regulation because there are crazy scams happening, and there are people that they are saying we are part of their team, but we are not. They create applications in the jurisdictions that nobody declares. So they are completely, beyond any legal control. So I have the feeling that also with artificial intelligence, I was entering rooms and people started by, I'm worried that I will not be able to have freedom of choice because what I see will be controlled and manipulated. After the pandemic, this changed. Everybody sees the potential in artificial intelligence. And what we need to do to release all this power that it could have as a technology in convergence with other technologies is to be able to say that we will make sure the way you use your phone, your computer, you're using a service online or an application that sends you messages or takes care of your economics, that AI will be controlled, will be safe and trustworthy, and it's going to be there, in a European level to complement what you do. I think we should have a follow-up when we conclude the file and
Absolutely.
Tell me if we managed or not.
That's when we give the final result. But I feel your pain about that, because in ethics as well, people think you're there to condemn and shut down everything, and that is not the case. But whatever we think about this proposed regulation, I think most people would agree that regulation is indeed necessary, and that this is a very ambitious and impressive step by the European Union to sort of try to set a kind of set the field in terms of what are the issues and put forward a genuine, concrete proposal. And I think we've been very privileged to have Eva talk to us about it and to have these two very insightful commentaries. So can we please thank them? Thank you. That was great.
And time went by so fast.
Yes.